You're listening to TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Hour, with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
Today is the 27th of November. This interview that we're going to have on today's broadcast, which you're actually listening to on the 30th of November, is one that I recorded back on the 6th of November. You remember, of course, the 6th of November was midterm election day across the United States. We begin with a little bit of conversation about that. Of course, at that time, there was also all of those stupid fake bombs that were supposedly being mail-bombed to all of the Democrats, and you remember that. Our guest today on our radio show here at TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour is Clint Lacy. Of course, our regular listeners know that Clint has been on 3 times over the last several weeks. And I would not have brought Clint back again so soon. In fact, I was planning on interviewing Clint sometime in 2019. We were going to talk about his book, False Flags, but all that bombing stuff was going on, and I thought, wow, man, this has false flag written all over it. So I called Clint. I said, hey, Clint, what do you think about this? Is this a false flag? And he goes, oh, of course it is. Of course it is. I said, well, let's talk about it on the radio. And so we recorded an interview back on the 6th of November. We also talked about the caravan and how the caravan is an even bigger false flag operation. Of course, that caravan has now reached the southern border. Today, like I said, is the 27th of the month. We're hearing on the news today that over the weekend that the president authorized the use of tear gas and other non-lethal force against these people who are trying to violate the southern border, that troops have been deployed to the southern border. Today, I was listening, and it appears that most of these migrants who are crashing the borders are actually, they're not women and children as the mainstream news media would have us to believe, but they're actually able-bodied men in their 20s and 30s, and that oftentimes they are using children and infants as human shields so that our Border Patrol agents and our military will not use force against them. Anyway, but we're talking about these things before they culminated, and now you're listening to this and they've culminated, so if maybe some of our predictions didn't play out exactly the way it happened, you'll know why that is. But our guest today is Clint Lacy. We're talking about his book on false flag operations. It's going to be a great broadcast, so let's just
last
jump
night
right
the
into
president and Rush Limbaugh were both there in Cape Girardeau, had a big rally.
Like over capacity, they had to funnel people into the rec room.
You know, we had you on the show, for a few times there, fairly recently, and I was going to have you on to talk about your new book on false flags, but I was going to push that into next year. But the reason I'm doing it now is because we just had a massive false flag, but nobody's really reporting it as a false flag.
The bombs.
Yeah.
I liked all the memes that came out afterwards, Cory Booker saying, where's my bomb? I deserve a bomb.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was so totally blatant. And it's a good thing because it shows people are somewhat awake now.
One of the things that I noticed, and I wasn't the first one to point this out, I think Rush Limbaugh may have pointed it out even before I did, was that if you looked at this guy's van, the bumper stickers weren't even faded. He had this old van with these brand new bumper stickers on it. If that wasn't a put-up job, I don't know what was.
Well, not only that, but if you got to reading on him, before he had his van plastered in Trump stickers, it was Native American stickers. And he's not Native American, he's Filipino.
Okay.
So, obviously, you can't go by what this guy says he is. And then as my life account, I guess if you're a member, you can go in and change anybody's profile, which I don't understand that. But it was switching from Democrat to Republican to Green Party, and they were saying he's Republican. I don't see how you can determine that when it's proven it can be so easily hacked.
So this guy is a Filipino white supremacist then, is what you're telling me.
Filipino with identity problems.
Okay, because I know some in the media were trying to, claim this guy was some kind of a white supremacist. So I'm just putting it out there now. Apparently he was a Of course, Rob Schneider. You remember Rob Schneider from Saturday Night Live?
Yeah.
He told Adam Sandler one time that he was a Filipino Jew.
Well, he says he is.
Which is why it was okay for him to eat pork, because apparently Filipino Jews have a different dietary law than all the other Jews in the world.
Yeah. Yeah, I seen a stand-up special with him. He said he was a Filipino Jew.
So apparently this guy's a Filipino white supremacist.
Well, according to the media, yeah. The media never even mentioned he was Filipino.
Okay.
But
I never saw a picture of him, so...
You remember George Zimmerman? Got shot Trayvon Martin. Media portrayed him as white, and he was Hispanic.
Right.
That's just what they do.
Well, did you hear Don Lemon's little bit on CNN Sunday? He's calling for a travel ban on white men now because of this.
Yeah, and he's gay and he's married to a white man.
Yeah.
How are they going to travel?
Yeah. We'll come back to this whole bombing thing. I guess tell us about your book. Your book's titled False Flags.
It's called A Truth Seeker's Guide to False Flags. And it's a history of false flags from America's founding until the 2016 election. There's a couple of them I didn't put in because originally this was going to be entitled A Beginner's Guide to False Flags. But TBR kind of figured out that there's really no beginners in their knowledge to false flags for their audience, so they changed it to A Truth Seeker's Guide.
So how did you decide for TBR to publish the book? Was it a situation where you just naturally went there because you write for the magazine, or was it a situation where other publishers had said they didn't want to touch the book?
I didn't even try other publishers. TBR's editor, Paul Angel, has a small publishing company, and that's who published Blood in the Ozarks for me. So it just seemed natural for me to pitch this to him when I was writing.
Well, I know the other books that you've written, like Blood in the Ozarks, were about the war between the states. They were about Missouri. And False Flags is not only a lot larger scope of history than just the war between the states, and also a lot larger field of the world, if you will, than just Missouri. What inspired you, or what got a hold of you to make you tackle such a large subject that's so far outside of what you've normally been writing about?
You want the absolute honest answer?
Sure. Yeah.
I was sitting at home after my hip replacement. I couldn't go anywhere until I was able to walk on a cane. Couldn't leave the house, couldn't even walk out the door. That was doctor's orders. And I was climbing the walls. So I just sat down at my computer and started writing the book.
Okay.
And Paul liked it so much, he told me to replace my other hip.
What was going on at the time that made you write about false flags? I mean, of all the things to write about when you're cooped up in the house like that, how did this subject get your attention?
Well, it kind of always been in the back of my mind. I've kind of toyed with the idea and really didn't decide, couldn't decide whether I wanted to do it or not. Like I said, I was climbing the walls. I thought I'm just going to go ahead, and it's an overwhelming subject. And I didn't know if I could write one on the subject because it's so overwhelming. But I just started with the first chapter. I went all the way back to the creation of America and then built upon that. I went through every era of American history by just doing one era at a time. It wasn't so overwhelming. I found it pretty easy to do after I got started.
I look at my lifetime, if you will, and I see things like the Oklahoma City bombing, and I've always thought that if some, fat deputy sheriff with a donut hanging out of his mouth could solve the crime of the century 10 minutes after it had happened at a traffic stop.
Yeah.
Something was up with that. I never bought into that theory for a minute. It had false flag written all over it. 10 minutes into the newscast, I saw false flag written all over that thing. You go back even beyond my lifetime. You look at something like, say, the sinking of the Lusitania, and you say, well, that has a false flag, written all over it. And obviously we know the motivation for that. It was to get our country into a war. But most of our listeners would probably think to themselves, what kind of false flags were going on at the founding of our country?
That's exactly what I thought after, I became educated on the subject. And what I found was when America started its rebellion against the British Empire, the colonies wanted to form a mutual protection pact. Some of the colonies were for it. Some of the colonies said, okay, but if we're going to risk ourselves like this, the British have to fire the first shot. And we've always been told that at Lexington and Concord, the British fired the first shot. They said that wasn't the case. Americans ambushed the British. And as I dug, there's actually diaries from British soldiers in that era that said the Americans ambushed them. One of the reasons we're told that the British fired the first shot was a lot of American veterans changed their diaries on the subject for future publication for their own gain. And the British soldiers' diaries, they were personal. They weren't meant for republication.
So was that the only false flag at that time, or were there others?
Going to maneuver a pact between colonies that has restrictions on it, then you have to make it look like they fired the first shot. Now, did it affect our history or our future very much? No, because it was going to happen anyway. But for the sake of argument, technically that was America's first false flag.
There's a lot of duplicity during the Revolutionary War. For example, I've often wondered if men like Benjamin Franklin and maybe even Thomas Jefferson didn't pick the fight here in the colonies and then go to Europe to wait to see how it turned out. And, had it turned out the other way, I have a feeling that Benjamin Franklin would have been right there in the royal court, pandering to be the leader of the subdued rebellion.
Very possible. He was, a lot of the stuff he did on behalf of the United States involved cozying up to the royalty. And, of course, there were a lot of other things about Benjamin Franklin. Quite frankly, he was a pervert. He used it to our advantage.
Right. I could definitely see where there could have been false flags there. We don't think of it that way. Again, probably because the history is written by the victors.
Right, and that seems to be the case with everything. It's written by the victors, so you're not going to get the true story. And you and I both know, as far as the history of the Confederacy goes, the quote-unquote Civil War, that was definitely written by the victors.
Well, I'm going to guess you probably unearthed a lot of false flags that happened during the war between the states.
In fact, the whole thing, kind of like the Revolutionary War, but on a bigger scale, the firing on Fort Sumter was a false flag, and it wasn't by the South. I believe it was Lachlan Seabrook that wrote a book on the subject. Either everything you knew about the Civil War or the South was wrong, something like that. But supposedly the Union troops in Fort Sumter were starving. That is Lincoln's reason why he sent supply ships that he promised he would never send. The fact of the matter is they had plenty of food. General Beauregard in Charleston, South Carolina, he was allowing women to take food to Fort Sumter to feed the Union soldiers, and he was allowing the soldiers to come into Charleston and get provisions. They were not starving, not even close. So, Lincoln promises he's not going to reinforce the fort, and the first thing he does is reinforce the fort in order to get the South to fire the first shot, so he doesn't look like the aggressor, when in fact he was the aggressor. And the reason he was the aggressor was 80% of the United States tax revenue was coming from tariffs on imported goods coming through southern ports. And they were going to fund public works projects in the north. So the South was paying 80% of the taxes and seeing nothing of it.
So was the Fort Sumter the only false flag then, or I'm sure there had to have been several?
It's the only one I really wrote about.
Okay.
Yeah. That's what got the war rolling, really, was this false flag to resupply these starving soldiers that weren't starving. And basically what I did is go through each era and cite one example.
Okay, so what were the eras and what were the examples? And let's just go through them one by one.
Okay, well, we already did the Revolutionary War. That was a compact between colonies who agreed to mutual protection if we did not fire the first shot. Lexington and Concord, we ambushed the British and made it look like they fired the first shot. The War of 1812, that was actually an operation to seize land in Canada, believe it or not. That's how that got started. And they thought the Canadians would totally support us, and that wasn't the case. Civil War.
So then you're saying the Americans started the War of 1812 and not the British?
Yes. As unpopular as that may be to say, yes, that's true. Civil War, War of Northern Aggression, that was Lincoln conducting a false flag to get the South to fire the first shot in order to protect his income through tariffs coming through southern ports. That is the whole reason he did not want the South to secede, because, quite frankly, he didn't care about the blacks. He didn't care about the slaves, and he said it time and time again until it was convenient what was it, 1863, they passed the Emancipation Proclamation. The election of 64 was coming up. Things were not looking good for Lincoln because the war was having an effect on the people, a lot of casualties. He might have been able to talk Northerners into a war to preserve the Union, but he was having a hard time talking them into a war to free the slaves. But it looked good. It looked good to say that the war was a moral, just cause now, which would have been slavery, the emancipation of slavery, instead of it being a war to protect his revenues.
Go ahead and interrupt here, and we're going to interject a commercial very briefly, about 60 seconds, for Clint and I's favorite magazine, the Barnes Review, and then we'll be back with our guest, Clint Lacy, talking about his book on false flags. If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
Spanish-American War, you might remember the war cry from that one was Remember the Maine. The USS Maine blew up in Havana, Cuba, in a harbor. There's been studies that show that was not an accident. That was sabotage. The evidence points to the United States itself as being the one that conducted the sabotage. Either way, it was either an accident because ammunition was stored so close to the steam engine and the coal and all of that. This is one theory, that the coal dust combusted and caused everything to explode. The other one is we did it ourselves, but either way, they used that to justify war with Spain in Cuba and the Philippines. World War I, that was a manipulation just to rally people behind attacking Germany. World War II, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, whose signature program was to put people to work in the civilian conservation corps to give them employment during the Depression, that was playing out. It was no longer working. Everybody knows you can only do that for so long, and it's going to implode. And it was imploding while he was telling the American people, we will not send our boys to fight a foreign war. Secretly, he and his cabinet were reassuring Winston Churchill that we will be in a war. In fact, they did everything they could to provoke the Japanese, oil embargoes and things of this nature. And they had plenty of evidence in advance that showed Japan was going to attack Pearl Harbor, yet they allowed it to happen. And the reason they allowed it to happen was because Roosevelt wanted the war. He needed the war because, like I said, his New Deal policies were no longer working. Winston Churchill wanted the war as well. Germany tried several times to negotiate peace with him. Churchill wanted none of that because he wanted the war too. Germany was an economic competitor to Britain. So they had this kind of unholy secret alliance where they allowed the war to happen. You know, they made sure that we participated. Korean War, there's evidence to show that U.S.-backed troops and CIA operatives were going across the southern border into North Vietnam and conducting operations there in order to provoke them. Vietnam was based on the Gulf of Tonkin incident in which supposedly Vietnamese ships attacked U.S. naval vessels twice, when the fact was they weren't even ships, they were just little machine gun boats, I guess you could say. And that only happened once. There was never a second attack, but they ran with it in order to justify Vietnam. This is what they wanted. Iran-Contra, in which I really don't think it was Reagan. I think it was Bush was the the creator of this, but they were flying drugs into the airport at Mena, Arkansas, northwest Arkansas in the mountains there. And they would sell the drugs. It was a distribution point. The CIA would sell the drugs, and they were taking the revenue to fund those who were fighting the communists in Central America. President George H.W. Bush, the father, and future President Bill Clinton, who was being paid to look the other way, in on this together.
Well, if you remember in 1992, when Ross Perot was running for president as the independent against George Bush and Bill Clinton, if you remember, he tried to bring this to the nation's attention. And Bush and Clinton pretty much joined ranks behind him to basically just destroy him over it.
You know, there's even rumors out there that Perot himself received threats against him and his family if he did not drop out, because he was on his way to winning that thing. And then he dropped out. And then he came back. Well, by then, nobody was going to vote for him because, you know, they felt like they couldn't trust him, which is, you know, probably what the powers that be wanted. Manuel Noriega, the invasion of Panama, basically he was a drug competitor, plain and simple. So he had to go. Then we get to Oklahoma City bombing, the Murrah building in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Supposedly blew up from a truck bomb that was parked outside, full of made from fertilizer and diesel fuel. And I just don't see how a truck parked outside exploding is going to bring down half a building. After that happened, witnesses talked about hearing bombs go off. It was much like the World Trade Center, where they talked about hearing several bombs go off. And then, you know, Timothy McVeigh was the patsy on that one. And before they got control of the media where they can direct the narrative, there were people on there talking about how they saw an Iraqi man, that supposedly this Iraqi man stayed in the same hotel as Timothy McVeigh. The only motive I can figure out for this was the militias were becoming popular. People were forming militias to stand up against infringements of the right on the government. So they blamed the militia for this, which gave them the green light to try and enact stricter gun control laws. Actually, before that was the first World Trade Center bombing, where they tried to blow it up from inside, and it was a whole FBI sting operation. But there's enough evidence out there to show that, you know, it was our own operatives that did it. They like using patsies, Dr. Ed. They get people into their ranks to make them think that they're performing a service for their country, and the next thing you know, the people find out they blew up something.
Yeah.
And that's the way they operate. Then we go to the first Gulf War, Desert Storm, in which Saddam Hussein threatened to invade Kuwait because of oil prices, oil revenue. And basically he said, if they will agree to our revenue terms, we won't invade them. If they don't, we will. And he met with Ambassador April Gillespie before we invaded. And she told him in no uncertain terms that the United States did not care what he did in Kuwait. So he unknowingly becomes a patsy, invades Kuwait, and next thing he knows, he's got the whole world against him. They did not take him out of power that time. That came later after 9/11. But we have 9/11. These are bombs going off. Personally, I don't think any planes brought down the World Trade Center. And to prove that, you go to building number 7, which was not damaged at all, and it implodes. And a half hour before it implodes, the BBC is saying that the building 7 has collapsed. And it was a half hour before it was imploded. Building 7's in the background as they're reporting it. It's clearly not collapsed yet. And then the owner, Silverstein, says, oh, there was so much damage we had to pull it. We made the decision to pull it. Pull it's a demolition term. Through my research, you know, you find out you can't just go in there and set a building up to implode within an hour or two. It takes a good couple of weeks. When you dig deep enough, you find out this is all a ruse. It's for more government power. In order to give the government more power, you have to scare people. And that scared people. To go back previously a couple of events, you had Ruby Ridge, in which a man who attended an identity church, I don't even believe he was even a member, Randy Weaver wasn't, but he lived in the mountains of Idaho, and the government wanted some info on this Christian Identity Church, and Weaver wouldn't give them any. And they realized Weaver was hurting for money, so they brought him a shotgun, paid him $50 to saw it off, and after that, they served him a warrant. He's not going into town because he knows he's going to be arrested. He's got a family to take care of. So they laid siege to his house. They killed his son. They killed his wife while she was holding the baby. And ultimately, Randy Weaver won in court. He won a huge settlement against the government. You also had Waco, Texas, the Branch Davidians, David Koresh. This was a man that was supposedly abusing people. Another kind of fringe Christian religious denomination. That's what we've been told anyway. So they lay siege to the compound when in fact it was well known that David Koresh, their leader, used to go to the shooting range with the local police. He used to jog every day. They could have just went out and snatched him anytime they wanted, but all these things are to send a message.
Well, if you want to get into the David Koresh story, I knew some of the Branch Davidians because I was pastoring in Texas at the time. And I knew some of the Branch Davidians. They started showing up to some political rallies and some events after all of that had happened. And they told me point blank that basically Koresh was working with DEA agents. And that there were 2 DEA agents who were actually living in their building there and who were posing as members of their church.
Yeah.
Specifically because that's where they were hiding to do their investigation from. And that essentially they had uncovered all of the evidence in that George Bush, Bill Clinton drug smuggling operation that we talked about earlier that was tied into Iran-Contra. The same one that Ross Perot had discovered the goods on was that David Koresh knew about it, that the DEA agents had uncovered it, and that all of the evidence that would have implicated Clinton and Bush was on computers in that building. They were on the computers of those DEA agents, which is why they entered the building not through the ground floor, but through a second-story window, because the target was the computers in the room where those DEA agents were living, sleeping, working, etc. And the reason that whole place had to be burned to the ground, and also the reason why the mock-up Waco compound was built by George Bush during his presidency, and the raid was followed through with and actually executed during the Clinton presidency, is because those 2 guys were holding hands on the thing because they both had to make sure that the goods didn't come out against them.
Well, once again, there you go. You got a guy that thinks he's helping his government. It's too late when they find out they're a patsy. You know, my advice based on my research of this book, if they want you to help them with anything, politely decline.
Well, the 2 DEA agents that Koresh was letting live in his compound were killed during the raid. And in the aftermath, of course, you know, the official report, they weren't DEA agents, they were Davidians.
It's funny because the man that wrote the foreword to my book, Matthew Raphael Johnson, the Barnes Review and American Free Press, that used to be called the Spotlight years ago. And they actually put a picture of this postcard that they received a week before the bombing occurred. And it showed an Oklahoma dust storm with some vague messages on it. And they sent it to the FBI because if they didn't send it to the FBI, they would have been accused of obstruction of justice. But they never heard anything again after they sent them that postcard. And like I said, this was like a week before the explosion took place. So they were flaunting it to them, saying, hey, this is what's going to happen. You can't do anything about it. We're letting you know right now.
Well, I'll tell you what happened to me right after September 11th. I would say probably about 3 weeks after September 11th. I was preaching at a church just outside of York, Pennsylvania. There was a man in the congregation who was the manager of the local Social Security office. And he got up and left during the middle of my sermon. And I honestly thought it was just because he was that offended over what I was preaching. And the message I was preaching, and I was preaching a message in the aftermath of September 11th, and the title of the sermon was "America is Praying, but She's Not Repenting." And what inspired that sermon and that sermon title was a few days before I was driving through Toledo, Ohio. And as you're driving up the U.S. highway there in Toledo, Ohio, just before you get across the line into Michigan there's all kinds of like strip clubs, dirty bookstores, stuff like that.
Yeah, you find those around military bases too.
Yeah, and there was this one strip club, and the sign said, "We're praying for America." It was the marquee on the strip club.
They were the ones praying.
Yeah, and so I thought to myself, America's praying, but she's not repenting. But anyway, so I'm preaching this message. And I really just thought that this Social Security administrator had just gotten, that upset over what I was preaching and had left. And so after the message and after the invitation, and now I'm standing in the foyer of the building, and I'm standing at my book table, and I'm signing books for people and talking to people as they're, leaving and so forth. And this guy comes back in from the parking lot. And he walks up to me, and there's a couple people, ahead of me that I'm signing their books, and so he kind of waits. And then it's his turn, and he tells me, he says, "Dr. DeVries," he said, "I'm so sorry." He said, I didn't mean to just get up and leave on you the way I did so abruptly. He said, "But there's something that you have to see." And he shoves a book in my hand. It's a paper-bound book with those spiral comb, bindings. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
And it's got a picture on it. It's a blue, kind of like cardstock cover and the cover on it is the Twin Towers with a 747 flying into them.
Holy
and
cow.
Smoke coming out of one of the towers. And he says, "Flip the page, flip the page." So I flip the cover over, and on the cover page, it says that it was printed in the U.S. government printing office in Pueblo, Colorado.
Yeah.
And he told me, he said 3 months ago, he said there was a big series of trainings. He said every government agency had to send every one of their employees to these trainings. He said they didn't all happen on the same day because we couldn't shut the government down. He said, but over the course of several weeks, he said everybody who works for the federal government went to one of these trainings, and the training was on specifically if there were a major terrorist attack in the United States, what would your agency, so in this case, what would the Social Security Administration do in the aftermath of this, horrible, devastating terrorist attack or national catastrophe? And it just so happened that the scenario that they laid out to the Social Security Administration workers was somebody hijacks an airplane and crashes it into the World Trade Center.
Yeah.
And the government was having a training seminar on this 3 months before it happened. You tell me that was a coincidence.
Well, here's a bigger coincidence. I'll say this book covers the JFK assassination as well, which will prove that was a false flag. But the Joint Chiefs of Staff for the Kennedy administration wanted to use hijacked airplanes, whatnot, to attack U.S. cities and blame it on the Cubans to justify a war with Cuba. That was in the 1960s. So that sounds really familiar, doesn't it?
It does.
Kennedy said no. But to go back to Kennedy, because I think that's an important part of the book, every false flag from the Kennedy assassination through the first Gulf War involved a president that was involved in the Kennedy assassination. They might not have been presidents at the time. It involved the CIA, and it involved the Mossad. Every one of these events from Kennedy on had those three components in them. Kennedy, there was a couple of reasons. I don't want to give away the whole book, but...
Well, give us something that would make our readers want to buy a copy.
There were several reasons why Kennedy was assassinated. One of them was Israel was mad at him. He was not getting along with the Prime Minister of Israel at the time because the Prime Minister of Israel would not allow U.S. inspectors to come into their country because we wanted to know if they had nukes or not. America did not want a nuclear Israel. Israel refused. Kennedy had it on good information that they had nukes. Another reason he was killed was the CIA had training camps in New Orleans and Florida to train these Cuban exiles for the Bay of Pigs operation, which most people probably know, but if they don't, that was a CIA-led operation to overthrow Fidel Castro of Cuba. And when the invasion started going wrong, Kennedy refused air support for it. So the CIA really never forgave him for that. Plus, Bobby Kennedy, as Attorney General, shut down their training camps in New Orleans and in an area in Florida. So he had the CIA mad at him. Israel was mad at him. He did not want escalation in Vietnam. He wanted to put U.S. currency on a sound footing again and back it by gold and silver. So these were all reasons he had to be, taken out of the way. And then on top of all that, he had Lyndon Johnson, who desperately wanted to be president. And that kind of coincides with the USS Liberty bombing. USS Liberty was an intelligence ship. Israel was fighting a war at the time, and the intelligence ship was in international waters, and it was attacked by Israel. Israel attacked it, they strafed it, they bombed it, they used helicopters and jets to strafe sailors that were in the water trying to survive. And a big reason for this was they wanted America in the war. They wanted the international community to think that, it was not Israel, it was another force that attacked it. And I think this was for two reasons. Like I said, they wanted America in the war. And the second reason was they wanted to show Lyndon Johnson who put him in office. It was a ploy to get America in the war, and it was also a warning to Johnson that he better play ball. And there's a lot of good writers over the years that have investigated this, and I've been able to take bits and pieces from everything they've done and come to this conclusion. One of the more interesting aspects is a method called reverse speech that was pioneered by David John Oates from Australia. And Jeff Rentz, the radio talk show host, had Jim Mars and David John Oates and a couple of other people on, and they were playing reverse speech from Johnson and other prominent figures. And what reverse speech does, you can take a clip of somebody, it's playing forward, and you can reverse it. And what this does is it reveals what the subconscious is thinking despite what the person is saying. And there were several of these clips. It backs up this theory, that I'm talking about. And before anybody says that's a bunch of hooey, the CIA has found it credible enough to use. So between what other people have written, what I found, and using methods like reverse speech that David John Oates has used, it all points that it was a false flag why he was taken out.
This is a good place to interject our next commercial for the American Free Press, and as soon as that commercial is over, we'll be back with our guest, Clint Lacy, talking about his book, False Flags. Particularly, we'll begin discussing the earmarks of how we can look at something maybe that we see in the news or that we read in the newspaper, and what are the earmarks that will indicate to us that this might be a false.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. You like to hear about the latest financial trends and to know what's happening around the world and right here in the United States, the things that can directly impact you, your life, and the life of your family. And if you're like me, you do not rely on the mainstream media to obtain this information because, frankly, you know that you just can't trust them. Fortunately, there is an alternative news outlet with a long-established track record for honesty and integrity, and that is the American Free Press. AFP is the preeminent alternative, independent news source for honest, hard-working, truth-loving Americans. AFP is the antithesis of the controlled, lamestream media. AFP is employee-owned and has been so since its founding. Because of that, AFP never has and never will allow advertisers or special interests or big money to dictate what appears in the pages of the American Free Press newspaper. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. AFP covers the stories and tells the truth that the lamestream media is frankly scared to touch. And AFP offers real, on-the-scene reporting and commentary, the likes of which you will never see in the Washington Post, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, or just about any other lamestream news source that you can think of. That's right, there's only one national populist news weekly staffed by an unsurpassed team of veteran investigative journalists who will dare to rip the veil off of many of the major news stories that are being censored and suppressed by the big money controlled media monopoly. And that's the American Free Press. AFP publishes exciting, in-depth, uncensored news and information that's grassroots and patriotic, information that Americans need to know in order to combat the growing police state. AFP stands firmly against the New World Order and against those who are working to establish a global plantation under the rule of a powerful few. In short, AFP is your voice. If you have any doubt why they want to silence AFP, you must be relying on the lamestream media for your news, and folks, that's a big mistake. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
What are the indications? In other words, what are the points that you can look at in any event? And if they're there, the markers, if you will, that you could say, yep, that's probably a false flag.
Well, you have to be able to find the information to back it up. But that's really no problem. One of the more wonderful aspects of the internet now is that the congressional archives are now online, a lot of them. You can go to archive.org and type in a subject, and it will show you all the books on that subject, and then you can open the book and type in a keyword you're looking for, and it will highlight little tabs at the bottom of the screen you can click on that has that information regarding that phrase. Besides that, what you want to ask yourself is who really gains from this? Who really gained from Kennedy being assassinated? Well, the CIA gained, Israel gained, the military-industrial complex gained, Lady Bird Johnson gained because she owned the construction company that was doing all the contracting for the bases in Vietnam. The Johnsons did. And September 11th, who gained? Well, the government gained. How did they gain? They were able to pass such stringent laws that invade your privacy and your safety. Well, supposedly for your safety, but can threaten your very freedom, can threaten your livelihood. Their powers grew immensely. And why did they grow immensely? Because Americans wanted to be safe, even though their own government conducted this operation. So it's a real tricky deal, you know. I mean, the government carries out the attack and then gets you to support these intrusive laws and restrictive laws on your liberty because you want to be protected from another attack. But guess what? They're the ones that did it in the first place.
You know, I've often wondered why there was not, for example, after September 11th, why didn't the airline industry, or at least just one or two airlines, just decide, you know what, we don't want these regulations? I mean, ultimately, what would have happened if United Airlines would have just gone forward with business as usual? And who knows, maybe the Air Force would have shot a 737 out of the sky with 200 passengers in it. Maybe they would have done that. But I don't think so.
Some people think that's what happened in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. With the plane, you know, remember the Let's Roll? The passengers took over the plane.
Right.
They tried to wrest control of the plane from the terrorists. Well, you know, the funniest thing about that, the most strange thing about that, there's no wreckage in that hole. There was no wreckage in that hole at Shanksville, Pennsylvania. It was just a crater. Where's the pieces of aircraft aluminum? Where's the engines?
Right.
I mean, you should see all this from where the plane crashed, but you don't. It wasn't there. And I'm sure the airlines probably get subsidized as well. So they're going to go along.
Well, you talk about where was the wreckage. One of the things that I always wondered about the Pennsylvania part of that story is the next several times that I flew after September 11th, I intentionally tried to make a call on my cell phone from the sky.
And you couldn't do it.
I will say that once you hit about 5,000 feet, your cell phone stops working.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I've read that too. But yet all these people got calls from their loved ones.
Exactly.
Right. One of the questions is, well, if it didn't crash in Pennsylvania, what happened to the passengers? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. Maybe it was just shot down and blew to pieces. I don't know. I don't know what happened to the people. Most likely they're dead.
Right.
Or they were sent somewhere and said, never speak of this again to anybody.
I know that there's one working theory that the plane was just flown out to sea and landed into the water. And it's buried at the bottom of the ocean somewhere with however many people on board of it, in a watery grave, and that maybe that's why they were able to make their phone calls, because they were at a low altitude.
Well, that would make sense. I mean, it's certainly possible. But like I said, there's so many things that don't add up. Like the hole in the Pentagon. Where's the plane wreckage? How come the hole looks so small? None of it really adds up. None of it does.
Right. Well, to bring this back to where we began, what was it that when you started seeing the news reports about these bombs going to all of these Democrats? And by the way, what the news media failed to report was that there was at least one bomb that went to a prominent conservative, because the Washington, D.C. area radio station that Mark Levine records his radio show from had to be evacuated.
Okay, we'll see.
Because Mark Levine got a bomb, and they had to evacuate the entire radio station. It was during the day. His is a night radio show, and it was during the day, and they had to go to recorded programming. I think it was around 10 o'clock in the morning or something like that happened. But the bomb was addressed to Mark Levine.
Yeah, see, I'd never even heard that. That's how covered up it was. I never knew that his station got a bomb.
Yeah.
And on top of that, experts came out and said those weren't real bombs.
Yeah. Well, Mark Levine made a big deal about it on his radio show one night, and he also made a big deal about the fact that Fox News refused to cover it, when he actually has a TV show on Fox News. So he was very upset that apparently even his own Fox News was part of the whole managed narrative on this thing, and that just really chapped his hide, and it should have. But what did you see in all of this that made you say, "Yep, false flag"?
The timing,
mm-hmm.
And I'll tell you why. The whole Kavanaugh thing failed. That was their last-ditch effort to destroy the midterms. Was to make Judge Kavanaugh look like a sexual predator. And nobody can remember where they were. Nobody can remember who was there. Nobody remembered any details about any of these supposed attacks. And it just kept going on and on and on. And it became so obvious that these were women paid. And it's come out now that some of these women were paid. Some of them have admitted that they were paid to make these accusations. Well, that didn't work. The caravan didn't work. The caravan of migrants, which they haven't arrived here yet, but Trump's deployed the military down there. But that didn't work. So this goes right back to what I was saying about the laws passed after 9/11. It was meant to scare people. And it's my belief that, these quote-unquote bombs were sent out to scare people into thinking that conservatives were dangerous. You don't want to vote for these people. This is what they're willing to do. That's what I think the whole motivation was. And another thing, if you notice, none of these envelopes had postmarks on them. They had stamps, no postmarks. So how were they mailed?
So you've mentioned the caravan, and so I was going to ask you that question then. So the caravan, I suspected it was a false flag, but definitely a false flag.
The caravan?
Yes, sir. The migrant invasion that we got going on here.
Well, yeah, I think that's a false flag. If these people are so destitute that they don't have food or jobs or anything else, how are they able to survive walking from, Guatemala to the U.S. border?
Right.
There's also videos of them hitching rides on semi-trucks. They're packed onto flatbed trailers going up their highways. But if you watch the news, they're all walking. They're all walking for a better life.
And you know what the news media doesn't report and what Americans don't probably comprehend? Because the weather's starting to cool down throughout the United States, even in places like Florida and South Texas, where you have nice weather year-round. It's still, the weather is still getting down into the 50s at night, and it's, we wake up in the morning and it's in the early 60s, and, the weather never breaks 80 degrees now here. But you go down to South Mexico, or you go down to Belize or Guatemala, or for that matter, you even get just, 300 miles south of the Texas border into Mexico. And they're still having 100-degree days down there. These people aren't walking in, in cool fall breezes. I mean, they're walking in sweltering 100-plus degree, high humidity, sweatshirt, off heat. And they have to stay hydrated and, everything else.
Yeah. The police in Mexico and the authorities in Mexico, they're getting firebombed and shot at and everything else from these peaceful migrants as they're coming through their country. Some of them even admitted they've been deported several times, that they're murderers, that they're rapists, that they're thieves, and that they're coming back. They're proud of the fact. I'm glad they're deploying the military on our border, but what I don't like is they said they're going to build tent cities for them and then investigate whether they're really seeking asylum or not. Well, how about you put the tent cities on the south side of the border instead of ours?
Right.
Because once they're here, they're here. So it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out.
Well, for all the people who talk about how Trump overreacts to things, they should be glad I'm not the president.
Yeah.
Because I would have troop transports off the coast of Honduras, off the coast of Guatemala, on the Pacific side and the Atlantic side. I would have them off the coast of Mexico on the Pacific side and the Atlantic side. I would have them in the Caribbean off the coast of, El Salvador and Costa Rica, all those countries. Not that I think there are a whole lot of Costa Ricans in this caravan, because Costa Rica is actually, a pretty nice country, and I don't know why people would want to flee from there, but I would have Marines off the coast of all of these countries that these caravan members have declared to be from. And I would make it known to the leaders of those countries, your people invade our borders, our Marines invade your country.
Yeah, well, that would make sense, wouldn't it?
Yeah. If this is a war, if you're going to invade us, we've got our Marines everywhere where they need to be, and no sooner than the Marines hit your beaches, we're going to have the infantry dropping in parachutes from airplanes, and you want to invade us, we'll show you what an invasion looks like.
Yes.
This is
definitely.
That's how you fight a war. And I guarantee that these countries, especially Mexico, would probably be doing everything it could to shut this thing down, because none of those Latin American countries want the United States Army and Marine Corps pouring into their country.
No, I don't believe they do.
But I guess our country can't do that, because then it would shut down the drug trade.
Good point. Shifting gears just a little bit, I'd also like to add that I included Boston bombing in this book as well. Right. The Boston bombing doesn't add up either, because it was announced they were going to have a drill shortly before the bombing took place. And once you get to studying false flag operations, you'll realize if you're notified that a drill is going to take place that day, it's best just to stay away from that area, because there's a bad habit of drills becoming reality.
That's an interesting point to make.
Yeah, they announced that the authorities announced that they were going to have simulated bombs going off and things of that nature, not to be alarmed, and all of a sudden a bombing actually happens.
Right.
What are the odds of that? And of course, this was during Obama, who probably did more than any other president or elected official in the United States to try and curtail gun purchases than anybody I've ever known of. And it was always the same gun, wasn't it? AR-15 Bushmaster. The only thing is, Adam Lanza's Bushmaster was left in the trunk of his car. It was never used. But supposedly it's the one that did so much damage. So that once you get to digging in this stuff, it never adds up. There's their story and there's the facts, and you cannot reconcile their story with the facts on any of this. And to me, facts speak for themselves a lot more than propaganda.
Well, what's always fascinated me is you would think as many times as the news media has blown it in their coverage of these things and been exposed, you would think they'd have enough practice by now that not only would they be able to have their story scripted before the event even takes place, you think that they would have all of their other ducks in a row as well, be it their interviews or their sound bites or their video footage. The fact that they haven't figured out how to do it without exposing themselves.
Yeah, well, they always mess up, don't they?
Yeah.
They never can't get their act together, and they always mess up at some point, and you have all these people, 300 million Americans? Isn't that roughly our population?
Yes, sir.
Somebody out of 300 million is going to notice something if you mess up, and somebody always notices something. And they're never smart enough to get their act together, like you said. Yeah. I don't know if it's out of arrogance or incompetence, but that's like the BBC I was talking about earlier, talking about Building 7 has just imploded or just collapsed, however you want to call it, and right there in the background was Building 7 a half hour before it collapsed.
Right.
You would think they would have known better than that, than to stand right in front of it while it was still standing.
So how does someone get a copy of your book?
Okay, you can visit my website, which is Clint Writes, CLINT, writes.blogspot.com, and click on the Truth Seeker's Guide to False Flags link at the top of the page. Or you can go to AmericanFreePress.net. I believe that's their web address, and you can find it on their bookstore. You can also order by phone, and that information's on my website, as well as American Free Press website.
We definitely want to encourage our listeners to do that. That is literally all the time we're going to have for this week's broadcast of TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Clint Lacy on false flags. A lot of stuff going on in our world that is not what it appears to be. And so hopefully you've learned a little bit of some of the critical thinking that you need to develop as you read the newspaper, as you watch the news, as you see the things that are being reported around you, so that you'll ask the appropriate questions and hopefully come to the appropriate conclusions and not just draw the conclusions that the mainstream media or that the propagandists would expect you to simply conclude based on their propaganda. I'd like to encourage you to go to clintwrites.blogspot.com. That is Clint Lacy's website. You can find out more about his book, False Flags, as well as his other books. You can read his regular blog posts, some great material there. Also, go to www.dixieheritage.net. That's my website. While you're there, request a free copy of my book, The Truth About the Confederate Battle Flag. And when you do, not only will I send it to you, no cost, no obligation, I will also sign you up so that you'll receive our newsletter every week by email, the Dixie Heritage letter. Again, no cost, no obligation. From all of us here at TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour, until next week, God bless.